Welcome to the Millionaire University Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Guerin, back in the saddle with you today. And on this edition of the MU Pod, I'm joined by Doug Sandler. He's the owner of Turnkey Productions, and he's the host of the wildly popular Nice Guys on Business podcast. Doug, welcome to the show, my man.
Brian, I am excited. I've had a chance to check out many episodes of your show. One thing I have to say is you're not hosting enough. You need to host more of your shows. I had to scour through everybody's episodes to hear your episodes. So you need to show up more often.
I know. It's funny. There was a week or so time where I was on a trip and didn't have any recordings go through. So myself and Kirsten and Justin and Tara are the ones that that produced the show, and they all started just doubling down when I took a week off. So it's like, guys, look, there's like none of me here. What's going on?
I saw that. It's time for you to step up now.
I know. I'm kicking it in gear here. I got to get more guys like you scheduled on here. But I've got a nice full schedule coming through March and April, so I'm excited, and I love this. And speaking of loving podcast hosting from one host to another, that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. Building a podcast, having a podcast, or just talking about podcasting in general, because that's what your business, Turnkey Production, does. And you've been doing it for the last 9 years, is my understanding. So, Doug, before we hop into that, I want to make sure we get a little bit of your origin story. How did you get to where you are today, and how did Turnkey Productions get to where they are?
Completely by accident. So I have to say that, talk about following your market. I wrote a book in 2013, 14, called Nice Guys Finish First, and I was looking for a promotional resource for that, some way to market my book, because it didn't have the deep pockets that a publicist wanted. Yeah, I think they wanted like $3 or $4 grand a month. And at the time, as a brand new business owner, it was like, oh my gosh, how am I ever going to come up with this? So I said to a buddy of mine who I've been friends with for probably 15 or 20 years before that, Strickland, I said, hey, Strick, I'm writing a book. I want to do a podcast, but I can't imagine doing it alone. Would you want to co-host it with me? Knowing that he knew a lot of like audio stuff and all the other stuff too that I don't know. He said, sure. I just have one question. I said, what's the question? He says, what's a podcast? And I'm like, I don't really know, but I've heard that they're really popular. So, that was the beginning of our podcast, the Nice Guys on Business podcast, which has been around now for, 10 years in 2025. And as of February, 1,600 episodes, 6 million downloads of the show, millions of dollars of revenue generated, like I said, accidentally. And that was really the beginning of the podcast that rolled into a business. One guy in our audience, the book called Nice Guys Finish First, was all about how to build relationships with your customers for business that will last a lifetime. But the reality of that was that a lot of people didn't want to hear about it, which wasn't horrible. I mean, sure, it didn't cost me much to put the podcast together. I'm like, okay, let's give it a try. Somebody in our audience, one person, his name is Lou, said, I love what you're doing with the show, but can you teach me how to launch a podcast? Because I love your customer service story and how to build a business and how to build relationships that last. But I don't want to learn that. I want to learn how to launch a podcast. So I said, sure, Lou, let's give it a try. I've never done it before. I have no idea how much to charge you, and I have no idea how long it will take, but what's on your agenda? He said, I have 6 months to put it together, and I got $3 grand in my pocket. Would you be willing to do it? I said, $500 a month for 6 months? Sure, let's give it a try. 6 months later, he had a show. He has been a loyal friend and also in the podcast business as well now, and making millions of dollars a year from his podcast business. And I love that we've created not only our competition, but a collaborative partnership in the process. So in a nutshell, make a short story really long, that was the origin story of Turnkey Productions.
Okay, awesome. So what exactly does Turnkey do?
So as the name would probably tell you, we do everything as it relates to podcasting. We help put people into the launch seat, meaning the host seat, where we'll build all of the elements for the show. We'll create the cover art, the show description, the professional voiceover open and close, royalty-free music, establishing the relationship with Apple Podcast, the 27 easy steps that you have to go through in order to launch a podcast. And then beyond the launch, we get into the production side. So whether they're doing audio and video or just one or the other, we'll produce, edit, and distribute them, and we'll help them with all of the collaborative materials that they need in order to market it or create an audience that is sticky, one that will come back over and over again. In a nutshell, again, that's what Turnkey does.
Okay. And do you help anybody anywhere who wants a podcast, or is it specific industry, specific people? How does that work?
Well, I think that in the beginning of our run as a production company, anybody that had a checkbook was a potential client, which is not a good way to start a business because you really don't know your market really well. What we have discovered through 9 years of doing this, that we really do very well in the financial, medical, legal, and entrepreneurship audience with those markets because we can speak their language. We understand what they're all about. We know, for example, in the financial and legal world, you deal with legal and compliance, and those are two things that if you've never launched a podcast within those spaces before, you could be turned upside down in 2 seconds. And that would be not a good thing to try to over deliver to a client when you have all of these things that you have to try to do. And you're running around like a crazy person trying to figure out what's compliance and what's legal. So I would say that while we can launch a podcast in any market, those are the markets that really find us that we excel in.
Okay, got it. So I'm going to go a little macro here. Why podcasting?
Yeah, I think that it's a valuable question. I think that people consume content in a number of different ways. And it's not only podcasting is the solution. It's podcasting can be a solution if you're looking for your market in a specific channel. For example, I was writing for a small organization called the Huffington Post. I wrote for them for about 3 years. And on Sunday night, I had to put together my blog post that came out on Monday morning. At least that was my self-disciplined schedule that needed to come out. They didn't care, but I needed to make sure that it was done. And if I didn't do it on schedule, then I would never do it. I agonized for 150 weeks. Sunday night, midnight came, and I'm like, holy, what am I going to write about for tomorrow? When it comes to podcast production, 1,600 episodes, I'm never out of things to talk about. I always feel like this is the easiest thing to queue up and do. I build relationships with somebody that's sitting across the virtual screen from me. I've gotten a ton of business through guests becoming clients and referral sources and affiliates and joint venture partners, people from my audience. So I don't know that podcasting is the only way, but I do know that from a consumption and content creation perspective, it works really well for me. Those that like writing, it might be a blog post. Those that like, I hate social media. Those that like social media, that might be their thing. But for me, as a content creator, it's extremely easy. And I find that people that listen to podcasts tend to be really open to listening to a number of different podcasts. It's not just a zero-sum game where they're listening to mine, so they're not going to listen to Brian's. So I find that my audience is pretty prolific, and they are eclectic, and they are everywhere. So for me, I love the idea of, from a content creation perspective and from an audience perspective, of building my market and understanding what my value to that market is.
So do you believe that, technically anybody who wants a podcast can have one, right? You can,
absolutely.
You can get a subscription to Squadcast. You can just do it yourself.
Do it.
But what do you feel as though, if there's people out there who, let's say they're a small business owner and they're thinking, a podcast would be fun. What would you advise them in terms of the purpose of this podcast? Because I learned this once I got into podcasting was, there is a much deeper purpose for podcasting when it comes to just content creation and just hearing your voice out in the ether. Right. And for me, it was relationship building. It still is relationship building. But do you kind of have to guide people, or kind of maybe for prospective clients of yours, do you ask them like, tell me why you want a podcast, and do you have to guide them through that? Absolutely.
I found that there's three reasons typically that people get into podcasting. They either want to build a community, so grow an audience. They want to be an insider, so they want to grow influence, or they want to make money. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to make money from your podcast. They all seem to be, from my experience, byproducts of each other. It's hard to become an influencer without somebody in your audience wanting you to help them. And it's hard to grow a large audience without a big community without somebody saying, could you show me how to do this? And it's hard to make money without growing influence and building a community at the same time. So for me, that's really where I start. Let's start with the end in mind. What do you hope to accomplish with your podcast? And then we reverse engineer through our experience and our process. We've reverse engineered why they're getting started and then build a system around that. So for me, I just wanted to sell my services. I just wanted to make money. Now, if I was a plumber and I had a podcast about baking, obviously there's a disconnect there that doesn't work. But if I'm a plumber and I have a plumbing podcast, it's the greatest thing. I can interview developers who in turn could potentially buy my services or refer me. I could talk about plumbing and somebody in my audience could say, hey, that's a plumber I really want to talk to because he really is professional. So there's a number of different opportunities within the podcasting space to make money. And that's what I examined. We have gone through this really in detail to understand that without a specific reason for getting started, you're just an arrow floating in the wind, and you don't have a target to shoot for, which is really difficult.
Absolutely. So you mentioned making money with podcasting. Let's jump into that, because that's probably the number one thing on everyone's mind is, podcasting is cool, but how do I make money doing it? And what's the pathway like for that?
Yeah,
it doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't happen overnight. It is a long tail approach to monetization. But if I were to say to you, Brian, if I were to ask you the question, hey, not knowing anything about podcasting, let's say an innocent person, where would you think money comes from when it comes to podcasting? If I just ask you that question.
If I didn't have any background knowledge, I would have to say, I guess you run ads or you have sponsors.
Totally. And that is absolutely the Joe Rogan, Tim Ferriss, Tony Robbins way of podcasting. The biggest challenge with that is Tony Robbins, Tim Ferriss, and Joe Rogan all came to podcasting with millions of people in their community already. And so you plug those millions of people into a podcast audience, and you've automatically built yourself a monetization monster. At $20 per 1,000 listeners, you can see that 10 million people listening to your show could equate to anywhere between $2,000 and $20,000 per episode with sponsorship. And you're in business and you are running fast. But if you're a normal person like me, now, I would assume that you're probably beyond where I am, Brian. At any point, you're beyond where I am. But in the beginning, I had 7 people listening to my show. It's like, I can't find sponsors with 7 people listening to my show. So we had to develop another strategy that didn't take 2 or 3 years. Now, collectively, over the years, we've had 6 million people listen to our show, and that could turn into some really serious advertising dollars. But the first 2 years, when you don't have a big audience, you might have typically an audience is 150 to 200 people listening to a podcast. A good size audience is 500. A massive audience for normal people world is probably 1,000 people listening to your show. It's not enough to build momentum to make advertising and sponsorship dollars. So I had to rely upon a different resource. Where am I looking for my money? Am I looking for my money in my audience, or am I looking for my money in my guest seat? And for me, the guest to gold strategy, turning podcast guests into clients, turning podcast guests into referral sources, affiliates, joint venture partners, and this 5th category, it's like, I don't really know where you fit into my world, Brian, but man, that was a great conversation. Why don't we get together and kick some ideas around and see where we can do something together? When you do that in a comfortable, non-pressure, non-salesy, pardon my expression, don't be a non-environment, then all of a sudden you have the ability to build a great relationship with somebody that could last a lifetime, and certainly you're having an opportunity to follow up multiple times with them, which just doesn't happen in the regular sales world.
Absolutely. And that's one of the first things I learned once I started hosting over here at MU was the fact that, in my mind, it was like, oh, that's cool. People are going to listen to me. I'm just the host, but I'm here to facilitate, But then after a while, I started realizing I'm meeting some pretty awesome people. These are entrepreneurs who I would never, ever have a chance to have met prior without this platform. And the relationships and connections I've built through hosting this show are priceless.
Absolutely.
And the connection doesn't happen with every single guest, but every few guests you connect with, you stay in contact with, and whether business comes of it or, like you said, partnerships, for me, that's the absolute coolest part of podcasting.
It's the hidden gift that nobody realizes they're going to get when they start a podcast. On top of which, you start to do things like 2 weeks ago, we had Grant Cardone on the show, which was amazing. Huge player in the game. Thanks. Gary Vaynerchuk has been on the show. Ariana Huffington, John C. Maxwell, Jeffrey Gitomer, White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain. I mean, these are I can't call Gary V tomorrow and say, "Hey, Gary, you want to sit in my guest seat?" But he was promoting something at the time, and he needed an outlet for it. And at that time, we did not have a big audience. So if those in your audience might be thinking, well, you probably had millions of people listening. Well, at that point, we had about 200 consistent listeners to our show. Same thing with Ariana. You don't need a massive audience to put somebody that is in a good position to help build your credibility, like Ariana, like Gary Vee, like Grant Cardone. The beauty of that is now when you put those names to your show, now you become the credible host that everybody wants to get in touch with. And while that doesn't directly relate to dollars that you have coming in the door, it certainly doesn't hurt to find a guest that you then could say, hey, Gary Vee and Grant and Ariana have been on the show. Would you be open to sitting in our guest seat? You come at it from a whole different perspective. You then feel like you own a media company that's significant, and people will find their way to you as a result.
Right. Things become inbound. It's almost like climbing a ladder where, like, let's say your goal is to interview Tom Cruise on your podcast, but you got to network your way up that ladder from one person who knows a person who knows a person who's a little higher than that person, who knows a person that's a little higher. And before you know it, you've got Tom Cruise's publicist on your podcast. And you're like, guess what? Who's next guest? It's going to be Tom Cruise, right?
100%. It was a great example. Tyler Schmidt, who is Gary Vee's right-hand man, was on the show, and Gary came on the show because of the relationship that I had built with Tyler, and because Gary was just launching his podcast at the time. All of that, for every Gary Vee, there was probably 99 others that said no to me. So although it might feel like it's a little bit of an ego metric to be able to land a get like Gary Vee or Grant Cardone, for every Gary and Grant that were on the show, there was 98 others that said no to me, that beat me down. So, I consider it a win, but at the same time, you have to stay humble in this game as well, and just approach it that way.
Exactly. I had a chance to interview Eric Sue. He's with Neil Patel, and if you're in the marketing space, people know who Neil Patel and Eric Sue are. But it was through, it was all friends of guests and friends of guests and friends of guests. And one of those guests happened to know Eric Sue, made an introduction. He said, absolutely. And here we go. That was one of my bigger interviews that I've had. And we've had some cool opportunities that have come from that in terms of guests coming on the show. So, it's all about kind of starting at the bottom and working your way up. So along those lines, when you're working with new clients or prospective clients, how do you it can take years for a podcast to take off. But one point I like to make is the fact that someone might want to start a podcast, and tell me if I'm wrong, with the dreams of reaching thousands and thousands of monthly listeners. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, you can have a wildly successful podcast and only have 500 or 1,000 or 200, however many listeners, depending on what your goal is. Is that accurate?
100%. And I really have to remind my clients that many times that you could make a healthy six-figure income with 200 people listening to your show. Just think about it. If you turn around and look at the studio, the third bedroom of your home or fourth bedroom of your home, like where I am, if I were to say every week, I'm going to put 100 people into this spare bedroom in my home where I'm recording my podcast, and they're going to listen to my message intently, they're going to ask questions, and then some of them are going to buy, you would say, man, that's great. You get 100 people in your house every week just to listen to you. Well, why is it any different if you have 100 people listening to your show? I'd rather have 100 people taking action than 100,000 doing jack. Mm-hmm. And that's generally what happens. I mean, think about as a podcast listener, how many shows that you listen to that you take no action. I listen to The Daily every day. Never called them, never bought a product that they've pitched. I'm not a valuable person for them. I'm a listener. Now, you take me that listens to a show that might have 30 or 40 listeners, but I'm buying a product or service from them. That's the reality of what you're looking for. So we teach people how to get to know their mom, their market, their offer, and their message. If they know who their market is and they have a specific offer for their market and they got their message dialed in, they will sell things through their podcast to their audience. But in the meantime, can't we put people in the guest seat that could become clients, referral sources, affiliates, and joint venture partners? And you could have a show that has literally nobody listening to it, and still create a revenue stream. And as a matter of fact, that's what we did 18 months into it. We turned the faucet on when we understood this guest to gold strategy that we have. The first month that we did that strategy, we made $35,000. We have never turned back since then. And that was basically 9 years ago with our show. So at the beginning, when we had 12, 15, 20 people and we were making 35 grand a month, it had nothing to do with advertising and sponsorship. It had all to do with selling the services to the right people. And in that case, it was our guests, not our audience. And it slowly has come full circle. We do sell things to our audience, but I still focus mainly on my guest seat, which is really the golden opportunity.
Right. And, there's something to be said for and I think it's a total mindset shift. At least it was for me when thinking like, oh, it's all about listenership and viewers and yada, yada. It's like, no, it's about the fact that you're the one behind the mic. You automatically, in the minds of those listening or watching the video, you are the expert. You are the authority in whatever you're talking about. And that applies to both the guest and the host. That seems like it worked in your favor as well when it comes to helping others actually build their podcast.
The biggest challenge that we have as a production company, as a strategy company too, because we really bill ourselves first as strategists and second as a podcast production company. The tool is the podcast, but the strategy is really what works. We've got to get our client's head out of the ego metric of the download. Because the ego metric of the download or listenership or how many people are tuning in or viewing our show, you can't take a download to Wells Fargo and cash it. They will not pay you a cent for a download, but they will pay you for services sold because you're getting a check from your client. And for me, and I hate to make this just about money, but the reality of it is that if you're not making money from your show, and let's say that you're putting in 4 to 6 hours a month, you're going to look at it as a time suck, another thing on your schedule that isn't accomplishing any direct result. So I look at it and think, I've got to turn this into a moneymaker for my clients or they'll go away because we're not cheap. We're probably the mid-range or highest, in the market as it relates to podcast production. But if you're making $150,000, $200,000 as a result of having a podcast and you're spending 12 grand a year or something like that with us to produce your show, do you care that you're spending 12 a year if you're making 200? So we really work hard at dedicating our role, our deliverables to making a professional sounding podcast production. Of course, that's ultra important. But the strategy of how do I actually turn this into something that's going to grow my community, grow my influence, or make me money is really what we're after. And that is it's not about how many people are listening to the show. It's are the right people listening to the show, which is the quality of any marketing campaign. Is it the right market that we're approaching, right?
Exactly. Do you find in prospective clients that, and I feel like it's common where, let's say there's a lot of business owners out there who want to have a podcast. I think that'd be a very valuable thing to have there in addition with their business. Yeah. And yes, that's very true. But do you find that they're distracted by the idea that, they don't have content, or what will they talk about? Or the fact that they don't, actually, this is a better question. If they don't have an audience, if they feel like they've got nobody, maybe they have a handful of clients who pay them for their service, but nobody else.
Right.
What do you tell them? Is that still an okay time to start your podcast? Or do you have to
Absolutely.
have a little bit of something going?
No. You think about it where I started. I was in the live events business. I spent 30 years as a high-end social scene bar mitzvah DJ. Okay, so I spent 30 years doing that. And then I went into this, thank you. I went into this production business. I had no clients. I didn't have anybody. I was trying to make the transition at 40 plus years old. I said, hey, I can't be 60 years old and still doing the cha-cha slide and the electric slide on the dance floor. I've got to figure out what's my next step in my career. So I started this whole new business that evolved into a production business. As long as you're willing to listen to the few people that are in your audience at the beginning as to what they want, and you will get feedback as long as you ask for it. If you don't have a call to action, you don't ask your audience for anything, they'll never do anything. But if you ask them for help, they will give it to you. You can discover your why and your what through your podcast. And that's the best part about it. You put your feet in concrete, and you say, this is what I'm going to talk about. I am a business guy. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm going to talk about my journey. Interview successful people that have accomplished what you want to. You could even use, if you don't even have a job and you want to use your podcast as an interview platform, you can interview people that are presidents of organizations that you would like to go to work for. And then they'll introduce you to people in their organization because unless you step over your words or you just don't talk and make sense, people are going to fall in love with you because that's just the reality of who people are. Unless you don't feel like you can string a couple of sentences together, then podcasting is a totally relevant and acceptable way for you to meet people that would be the next step for you in your career.
Yeah, it's an incredible way to just start building relationships. Even if you're uncomfortable or you feel that you're introverted, it's a perfect way to just grab yourself by the collar, sit in front of a microphone and start talking. Or better yet, have guests and let them do the talking. All you got to do is ask the questions.
Absolutely.
What do you think I'm doing here?
and the beauty of it is when you're in podcasting and you're hosting an entrepreneur or business leader or owner or anybody that's an expert in whatever field, your best approach is just ask questions and just shut up. Just ask questions. Just be a third grader and just ask, how does that work? And be curious. If you're eternally curious, podcasting is a great space for you. I've had so many people sit in that guest seat that talk about subjects, artificial intelligence and the environment and politics and business, and so many people. Sean D. Nelson, who created a company called Lovesac, a $1 billion organization, a free coach. I've spent many times on the phone with him, and after the interview, emailing him. He's given me gold advice that he would probably be compensated tens of thousands of dollars for, but he doesn't mind answering for me because I'm just curious, and I came across as someone that wanted to know more about his organization and how he built his business, and that's legitimately what I wanted. There was no pretense, and there was no calculation in that. It's like who I am. I'm very curious.
Yeah, me too. That's part of why I love this, because I just get to be. When I was a little kid, my dad he called me the why boy because I would just always be why this,
right.
why that.
Right.
And so this fits me well because I just get to ask people all the time, why, how, what, who, how, why.
And you don't even have to know about their subject matter. I can't tell you how many times I've showed up, 5 or 10 minutes before the interview, look and see the bio of the person that something that they wrote. Go to ChatGPT, have them put together a more casual intro than their bio, which is really kind of sterile. Like what you did today was great because it wasn't like I sent you a bio and you could have read it verbatim the way but that doesn't sound good. It sounds like you're reading a piece of paper. It's much better to be you, authentically you. So appreciate you doing that. But that's real how I approach each interview. Sometimes I don't know anything about the people before I hit the record button, and that's okay too.
And honestly, I think that's possibly the best way to do it, at least for me. And I learned that from Justin Williams, the head honcho at MU, where he found me and asked me to host with him and be a partner in the business. And he's like, you also want to host a podcast with me? I'm like, I've never done that before, but yeah, why not? I'm a yes guy when it comes to this. And I've learned so much from him on just be curious and just ask questions. That's all you have to do. You don't have to blow out and create a script or any of this. You don't even hardly have to know the person. Just hit record and start talking.
Totally, 100%. Landed that plane very well. And that's another thing that's really challenging for some people. They want to know everything before they get started, whether it's about podcasting or the guest. I had somebody yesterday that actually, and I won't throw anybody under the bus, but a client of mine said, I've spent hours preparing for this interview and then they rescheduled. And, it's like, I haven't been able to get them back on the books yet. And I said, well, first of all, why did you spend hours, trying to prepare for it? If you approach it a little bit more casually, take the pressure off of yourself. Why are you putting yourself under this much pressure to have a podcast? I am proof positive that you could have a podcast, stay in the game for an extended period of time, literally making millions of dollars from your podcast over the years. This has been the most fun that I've ever had doing anything, and it feels so natural to me to fit into this space. And you know what's really even great about it? I don't ever have to leave my house. So that makes it even better.
Isn't that the best part?
Yeah.
I love it. Well, so let's talk a little bit more specifically about your business. Now, one of the things that I'm really curious about is the fact that anybody and their brother can start a podcast. You can go get a subscription to Squadcast and you can find an editor, freelance. You can do that and have a fine podcast. What about using a production company such as yours? And obviously, since you're here, you specifically, what do you offer to clients that they can't get on their own or that they wouldn't be able to figure out?
Well, there's a couple things people have to keep in mind. And I learned this a handful of years ago, not through Turnkey, but just because of this is just how I analyze my life and my career. We all have a gift that we share with the world, whether that gift is relationship building or web making or marketing or whatever it is that we do. When I find I am outside of my zone of genius, whatever it is that my gift is, when I find I'm outside of that, I'm not happy and I'm usually not making enough money. And they go hand in hand. So yes, you can start your own podcast. Do you really want to go through the 27 easy to find and figure out steps to launch a podcast? Do you really want to create your own cover art? And do you really want to build a show description and do the voiceover and find royalty-free music? And do you want to go all the steps just to have a maybe on the tail end of that? So Turnkey provides all of that stuff. We also provide the accountability. So, when you have someone that is not only there, but doing the work, it's a done for you service. It's not a done with you service. It's a done for you service. So when somebody buys our services, we take care of everything, soup to nuts. You continue being a financial planner, a doctor, a financial advisor, whatever it is, the entrepreneur, whatever it is that you do. When you see yourself stepping into, audio editing, every minute that you're in audio editing is every minute that you're outside of being an entrepreneur. So why not hire a company? And we find that when you have the ability to hire someone, you're going to stay in your zone of genius and be much happier. So for us, if there is anything that I could say about why wouldn't they use a production company, use Turnkey, use somebody else. I don't care. Just don't do it yourself. That seems to be, unless you're an audio editor or a producer or a content creator, don't spend any time in the mechanics of building the podcast. The other thing, just real quick, that we really focus on, our competitive advantage, is we focus on the strategically. Why are you building a podcast? Are you doing it because you want to grow a community, build influence, or make money? Let us help you do those things. When you're doing that on your own, you have no idea how to do that, using podcasting as the tool. So those are just a couple of reasons why we encourage people. If you're not going to use a production company, or if you're not going to, don't do it yourself, use a production company. Certainly, we feel like we have the competitive advantage because many of our clients came to us because, one, we over-deliver on everything that we do, and they've heard about that. Secondly, we know what we're doing. We're a professional sounding organization. We make a professional product. And most importantly, we provide the level of accountability and strategy that companies just don't do.
So do you guys end up coaching or consulting your clients on, like, do you listen to episodes, or can they go to you and say, hey, Doug, or whoever's on your team, can you listen to this last episode and let me know, what am I missing? Is this okay? Is my call to action crappy? Do you guys help consult on those things as well?
Absolutely. That's the thing that we really feel like is a really important component that most people that are creating podcasts are just trying to, well, how do I land the right guest? How do I create the interview questions? But you got to keep in mind, you have to have a solid call to action. You give your audience too many things to do and they're not going to do anything. So give them a solid call to action. You have to put a guest in the guest seat and understand the reason why they're sitting in the guest seat. Is that guest going to help you with growing your community? Are they going to help you build influence? Are they going to help you make money? And you have to create a series of interview questions that are related to the strategy and the reason why you're having them on the podcast. So yes, if a client says to us, "Hey, can you listen to these interviews and tell me what I'm doing wrong? I don't seem to turn the corner on monetization." We definitely want to get a closer look at what they're doing on the air so that we can help them, off the air with monetization.
What does your team look like? Who's on your team? Like, is it made up of editors? Are there coaches? Are there experts? What does the Turnkey team actually look like?
So we have 5 people here in the U.S. and 12 people overseas. Our overseas folks do mainly the editing, show notes, and production and distribution posting. The folks here in the States are doing a lot of the training so that we can get through the launch, coaching so that we can help you with the strategy. Every one of our US based people are all podcasters themselves, so they understand, and they've all been launched by the best resource to find your team is from clients that you've launched their podcasts. So all of our team members are people that we've either launched or producing their podcasts, and they understand the relevance of what we're saying. And it really is a matter of just making sure that we're strategically staying in the game with our clients so that we can help them build community influence and money.
Do you have trouble with clients that, or do they have trouble sticking to their schedule? I imagine you guys say there's a frequency, a cadence that you have to commit to. Do you ever run into issues of, hey, we didn't record this week, we ran out of time, or we had a massive issue at the financial institution or whatever? What happens in those scenarios?
Sure. And that is something that happens, but we really do train up front how to avoid that. Things like batch recording and putting episodes in the recording bank. I mean, those are essential components. You don't want to do a weekly podcast and record weekly. I'd rather you do 10 in 1 month and be able to take the next 12 weeks off, or something like that. Because when you're in flow, I don't want somebody to have 4 interviews in one day, but because that gets to be exhausting, as you can probably imagine. But if you did 2 interviews in a day, and you did a couple this week and a couple next week and a couple the following week, and you have a podcast that comes out, the frequency has once a week distribution, you'd be a month ahead of the game in 4 weeks. So if you can stay ahead, we have some clients that are 5-6 months ahead of time. We have some clients that we are constantly saying to them, hey, we don't have an episode that's coming out on Thursday, it's Tuesday. But we really do try to instill the system and the process of do some batch recording, get your guests lined up, use automated scheduler so that you can get everybody, put together quickly, make it easy for them so you're not chasing them for bios and headshots and all of the stuff. So we do have a really well dialed in system and a great project management process that we put them through as well. But yeah, it happens, but more infrequently than frequently.
I want to talk a little bit, a couple specifics, and I've learned this through being in the podcast game, but what are some podcast host or even guest etiquette? Like, for example, if you're hosting a podcast, you're a new podcast host, you learn the ways of how to email people and how to get them booked. But do you have like a quick and dirty tip or scenario on how to, now that you're hosting a podcast, what's the proper way to get a guest? And what are the little things like with the sheets, the forms, the headshots, things like that?
Yep. So first of all, automate as much as possible. So you want to automate your pre-qualification process so you can pre-qualify somebody pretty quickly. We have on our turnkey site, we have, even on our Nice Guys on Business site, which is the name of our podcast, we have a guest inquiries page. They can just click, fill it out, and it makes it really easy on the inbound for us. So we're just looking at sterile information that they have sent over rather than they've sent me a headshot and they've sent me why they should be really good guests. All of that stuff is important, but not yet. I want to figure out on my system, in my way, how can I be most efficient with that? So a pre-qualification application. Once they're given the green light means they're going to get my schedule. But in order to get access to my schedule, they have to follow 4 simple rules. 1, you got to have a microphone, plug and play. 2nd, you got to listen to an episode so that we know what you say, what we sound like. So when you step into our environment, you're comfortable with that. Next thing, you've got to rate and review the show, because the lifeblood of any podcast is the ratings and reviews. And the final thing, you've got to share with me what your plans are to share this on social media. If you can't do those 4 things as my Nice Guy rules, you don't get my schedule link. So once they've agreed to the rules, again, all automated. Once they agree to the rules and they take care of the rules, next thing they get a schedule. They fill out similar information, but not the exact questions that we ask in the pre-qual, and they get set up. So it may sound like it's a lot of stuff, but because we're so efficient with it, they're actually communicating with us less than they would if it's just a show that's kind of haphazardly putting this stuff together. And we've got a really good flow. That's if we say yes. If we say no, we still give them access to the show. It's through sponsorship. And we find a lot of people are sponsoring the show through this thing that we have called our Fast Pass. We don't have any room on the show because they don't qualify based upon their application. But if they would sponsorship ranges anywhere from $500 to $1,500. They can have access to the guest seat. Guest seat includes a seat on the show, also includes social media promo, email blast. We help them promote their business so they can see the value. our clients, many of our clients come through that pre-qualification application because we ask some questions on that pre-qual application that helps us determine whether they would be a valuable client or referral source to our business. So I know, again, that sounds like a lot, but once you get that system dialed in as a host, it's off and running. And that's one thing also, that when you launch your own podcast, you have no idea administratively how to handle this. It is a huge pill to swallow if you've never done it before. And we make it easy because we just plug everybody into our system that we've already built.
Well, and especially if you are a business owner running a business, you have your day-to-day, your people, everything else that you do.
Right.
In addition to trying to, like, I like to tell people, starting and running a podcast is another job.
Totally.
There is a lot, if you're going to do it right, it is another job. So that's why, using companies like yours absolutely makes sense, because there is a lot that goes into it if you're going to do it right.
Well, and I just shared just 3 of those: the pre-qual, the rules, and our actual scheduling link in the Q&A that we fill out. I just shared 3 things that you could automate so simply if you know what the process is. And that's just 3 of probably 20 things that we share with our clients. It's not only that, but it's like, okay, now that I've put everybody through that, what happens after the interview is over? How do I get a client from this? How do I get referral sources? And how do I develop this affiliate relationship? All of those things are things that we plug people into a highly technical, well-built system that's easy to follow even if you're not a techie person. So that it's the best thing that we have been able to create over the last 8 or 9 years of doing this, and we've got it dialed in tight.
Well, Doug, we're up against time here. I've got one last question that is probably on a lot of people's mind. It's on my mind because I'm always curious. I always get guests that I bring on. I ask them about this. What's the best podcasting microphone that somebody could buy?
Well, there are a few that are really good. I would tell you, keep it simple. Do a USB plug and play. That way you're not plugging into a preamp and using all sorts of different cables and then worrying about the levels and all of that. We use the Shure MV7. We used to use the Yeti, Blue Yeti microphone, which was great also. We just found that this one was even a little bit easier. They have new ones out, but Shure or Blue, both of those make some good microphones.
Yeah, that's as a podcast host, as you know, that's the number one thing that we need to make sure guests have is a good connection, a good microphone, no echo. The one I'm using, a Samson. I don't even know the model, but the very first podcast I was ever a guest on was the Nick Loper Side Hustle Show. Yep. And he gifted me this microphone. I'm still using it to this day, 4 years later. And it was the best thing he could have ever given to me, because I'm sure I would have been like, I'd never been on a podcast. I didn't know. Would have been talking through my earbuds, and it would have been awful audio. Now that I know this, listening to hundreds of other podcasts before, I'm like, that's terrible audio. This is a bad experience. The one that you have is very similar to the Audio Technica. I think 1100. I think that's the Audio Technica version of that Samson microphone. There are a ton of microphones, and you don't have to spend a lot of money on a mic. For under $300, you can get a high quality microphone. But if you are just kind of not sure that you want to do this, just go out and find any USB is better than the built-in microphone that you have on your computer, no matter how good your computer is. Spend $40 and get, something like there's a company called Tonor, Tonor. They sell a $39 microphone. I just happen to have it set up, and it's like, it's so cheap, so inexpensive, and just, I don't know. I just like messing around with all these microphones. I have a bunch just to see how cheap can I go and still have quality sound. And these $30, $40 microphones, you can get some really good sound out of them too. Yeah, it's the number one thing you got to do. At least in my book, you got to have a good microphone, and encourage your guests to have some sort of good microphone as well, because
make it a rule. Make it a rule.
Make it a rule. Yeah, just like Doug, make it a rule. We do the same thing at MU. We make sure everybody has a solid microphone to make sure that our audio is great for all our awesome listeners out there.
And I even have clients that will actually send to their guest a microphone because they don't want to sacrifice sound quality for money.
Yep, and that's exactly what, shout out to Nick Loper, that's what he did with me when he saw I'd never really been on many podcasts before. He asked me about my mic situation. I'm like, I don't know, it's in my computer. He said, just check your mail in a couple days. So it was like, I looked it up afterwards. It was like a $90 microphone. So he gifted it to me. Thanks, Nick. And it's been working ever since. It makes all the difference in the world. So
agreed, man.
I figured we'd get a good discussion out of that last question.
Yeah, very good.
Awesome. Well, Doug, we got a wrap here. This has been an awesome pleasure to have you on the show today. You shared a ton of information with us, a ton of knowledge. I think there's a lot of actionable advice and inspiration involved today. So first of all, thank you for joining us. And second of all, I want to make sure any of our listeners out there who want to check out Turnkey Productions or check out Doug Sandler. And also, again, I'll say it and you say it again, the Nice Guys on Business podcast, check it out. But how else can folks get in contact with you?
If anybody in your audience has any interest in starting a podcast, or at least in talking about podcast curious, let's call you, just get my toolkit. It's turnkeypodcast.com/toolkit. In the toolkit are things like 5 ways to make money podcasting, another document, how to start, grow, and profit from podcasting, how to be a great guest. A lot of the things that we talked about today are in that toolkit. So turnkeypodcast.com/toolkit.
Awesome. And we'll go ahead and throw that in the show notes too. So for everybody listening, check out the show notes, hit that link, and get more of Doug Sandler.
Thanks, Brian.
All right. Yeah. All right, Doug, that's a wrap for us. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.
All right.